So let me start off by saying a few words about the background and content and objective of this talk. I'm very grateful to the foundation for inviting me to give this talk. I still remember, last time in the past, without the COVID, I was invited to give talks to visiting American students, college students, and I would take them around on our campus. But now, because of COVID, we can't do this anymore in person. Instead, we have to do this online, right? And so, what is the background of this talk? What is the content? What I'm going to discuss, and then what is my objective? Like I said, the relationship is very important, but the relationship is also becoming very difficult. And to many people, this is becoming alarmingly in a downward trajectory. You see a lot of contentious issues between the two countries, like Taiwan and Hong Kong, Xinjiang, Tibet, Chinese human rights, the high technology, trade war, and you look at the conflicts in Ukraine and Russia. Even though China is not any directly or indirectly involved in that conflict, but a lot of Americans have this assumption that China is somehow behind the war in Ukraine and Russia, right? And so the Chinese, I think to understand the whole thing, my purpose is not to say that, to get you guys to have more, a supportive attitude of Chinese government's policy. My purpose is not to change you guys, instead to get you guys a little bit of background about how Chinese people think and how Chinese culture is so different from American culture. So the two cultures are fundamentally different. I spent 6 years in Chicago, and as a political scientist, I very much enjoyed mingling with local people in Evanston, in Chicago. I drove from Chicago all the way to San Francisco. I took a flight from Chicago to Charleston and rented a car and driving down from Charleston all the way to Key West. I flew up to Alaska to get a taste of Alaskan king crabs and salmon fishing in the summer. So I tried, as to borrow a little bit from Alex de Tocqueville. To understand America, you have to travel around America. You have to get a real sense of how local people feel, they talk, and what kind of food they eat, and how do they socialize with each other, right? And so the more I traveled around the United States, the more books I read about America, the more people I talk to, I realize that the two cultures are indeed so different. If not reconcilably different, but they are almost fundamentally different. And these cultural differences have undoubtedly contributed to the fraught bilateral relationship. Number two, the talk discusses these differences and their implications for the two countries' domestic politics and foreign policy. So you have culture, and we all know culture is largely resistant to change. So you have American culture. One example is that Americans like to drink cold water, right? This is a very, very puzzling for the average Chinese, where they would like to drink hot water. So if you have Chinese tourists going to America or Europe, the one thing that they would look for immediately when they check into their hotel room is that if there is anything to boil hot water. But in America, Americans are used to cold water, right? This is a culture. And you ask people why. Oftentimes, there is no direct, clear answer of why people do this or do that. It's just a habit, a custom, a tradition, right? Passed down from one generation to another. And so it's hard to say which culture is good or bad. And then that kind of a normative judgment is prohibited. Largely, people don't talk about which culture is better or worse, right? Because you do not want to project your own values into other people's cultures. And so when you say Chinese like to drink hot water, Americans like to drink cold water, you can't pass judgment about this. It's just a different way of drinking water. And three, more specifically, this talk will focus on the two countries' different attitudes and norms about the state, the relationship between an individual and the state, social interactions, religion, and identity. Okay. If we have time, maybe we'll just go into a little bit about identity. But I think for now, I'd rather skip identity because this is getting very complicated in the United States. Whereas here, this is a largely not an issue at all. Finally, awareness of these cultural differences will surely help both sides to reduce misunderstandings and to better appreciate each other's policies. Again, I think, understanding each other's culture does not necessarily mean that you guys would support, identify the other country's policies, but rather you would, next time, if you want to criticize and question, especially the motivations behind that policy, you ask yourself, if I were the Chinese, if I were Americans, would I have done things differently? Would I do things similarly that they do today? So that's my purpose today, given the overall state of the bilateral relationship. I think it's imperative that college students understand the cultural differences and try in their role as kind of a cultural messenger between the two countries to bridge that kind of a cultural gap and to facilitate and foster this better understanding of the cultural differences. Let me start first with the role of the state. Okay, I teach U.S. politics. So this kind of like, U.S. politics 101 for American students, right? In the United States, Americans have this deep-rooted distrust of government, going back to, the arrival of the Pilgrims like Mayflower or the first settlement in Plymouth in 1607. I've been to Jamestown, I've been to all these places. Just want to get a sense, this American national heritage, right? Because America is a country of immigration, and it started with the 13 colonies, and the British monarch was on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. I remember back in those days, there was no transatlantic cruise ship, there was no Concorde, there was no Boeing 747. It took several months to travel across the Atlantic Ocean. So even if the British monarch would have preferred to have an iron hand control over the new colonies, he could not afford to do this, right? So Americans started with this tradition of self-government and democracy. And so and also remember the Pilgrims fled the UK and the Western Europe because of a so-called religious persecution. They were persecuted in Europe, and they were, because of this, they hated the government, especially a powerful, omnipresent government. And so that's why they sailed across the Atlantic Ocean and set up the 13 colonies, which eventually evolved to become the United States of America. And so this deep-rooted distrust of government, particularly in big and remote government, like a central government or national government. So for you guys, I don't know how many of you have taken, introduction to American politics in your college courses. Now, the first, I think, the standard textbook would start with the U.S. Constitution, right? If you go read the Federalist Papers, you go read the U.S. Constitution, you read the Declaration of Independence, and you get a strong sense that America is born anti-government. Americans are inherently distrustful of government, big or small, but in particular, big and remote government. And so that's why the 13 colonies at the very beginning, when they declared independence in 1776, they had this Articles of Confederation. It was a very loose confederation of colonies. But after the end of the War of Independence, the 13 colonies realized that in order to survive in North America, in order to maneuver between the big powers like the French and the British, at that time their they had the world's most powerful navies. They had to have a far more powerful central government. So that's why they convened in Philadelphia in 1787, and they drafted a new constitution for the United States of America. But even in that constitution, you can see that the founding fathers were deeply, again, suspicious of big government. Now, you don't have to be a Thomas Jefferson or Benjamin Franklin to be anti-government. You see, even people like the strong so-called Federalists, like Alexander Hamilton, they even though they prefer a much more powerful government than the Continental Congress, but they all agreed that a limited government, a government that protects individual liberties, is far more important than a government that has the potential to trample individual rights. Right? So you have this separation of powers and checks and balances, federalism, Bill of Rights, and the other precautions against a powerful national government. So in other words, let me summarize. Americans, they view the state, the government, with an inherent or intrinsic distrust. They don't like this government, especially the one that is remote, separated from them. So in the United States, you have the central government, that is the national government in Washington, D.C. You have state government, you have local government, right? That's like the three-tier governance structure. And then Ronald Reagan, when he was inaugurated in 1981, he had this famous saying, government, he said, in our present crisis, government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem. Now, this is a kind of a now most widely quoted word for conservatives who are opposed to a strong, big government, welfare state, and others, right? But the Reagan's aphorism, I use the word, his words really nicely summarized Americans' this distrust of government. So that's about America. I don't want to go into the details about American political system. I think the audience all have taken civics classes in high school, and probably some of you have taken American government classes in college. And so you know that part of the story. America is born liberal. Liberal in the sense that you have a strong preference for protection of individual rights. You want the government to be away from you. And so the least government is the best government. Of course, government is necessary, but it's just like James Madison said, it's a necessary evil. You have to have a government to govern. But once you enable the government to govern, the second thing you need to do, as James Madison argued in Federalist Paper number 51, is to oblige the government to control itself. So in that sense, when Americans are invited to set up a constitution for, let's say, newly independent country, Americans often at times come up with their plan. The first point is that how to limit the powers of the new government. So if you have Americans as constitutional advisors, when they draft a new constitution, I think they would almost always think about the first 10 amendments to the US Constitution, the Bill of Rights. But America is unique. America's history, America's founding is so different from other people that Americans' distrust of government and their habit of setting up these institutional checks against the government power usually do not apply to other parts of the world. In many parts of the world, the number one priority is to enable the government to govern first. And second, you would come up with mechanisms to check, to make sure that the government does not abuse its power. Okay, that's about the United States. What about China? Now, our culture is very different. In China, for the average Chinese, they have a deep-rooted trust in government. Now, the American students, you may wonder, how come? How is this possible that people have this deep-rooted kind of born or innate trusting government. Now that's our culture. If you know the word Confucianism, right? Now in Confucianism teaching and philosophy, the government is for the good of the people. And so even though we don't have like Western style competitive elections at the national level or provincial level, but according to Confucian culture and the Confucian teaching, government officials, they pass the civil service exams. That means they have merits, they deserve a government position. And once you are in that position, you are expected to serve the people and to work for the people. And so people in turn would automatically trust your judgment. Okay, so our relationship between the individual and the state is very different from America. And especially in China, there's you look at the scale of trust. So the higher level of government there is, the higher trust, the more trust people have. That is, the Chinese people tend to have the highest level of trust for China's central government in Beijing. And then their trust declines, in the order of the level of government. So from the central government to provincial government, you have a decreasing trust. And then at the county or township level, people tend to have the least trust of local government officials. Like I said, in China, the public expects the state to be omnipresent, omnipotent. And so in the West, you have this term, totalitarian, to describe countries like China. Now the word is kind of a pejorative terms, right? It's a negative term, but I think it largely describes the actual state of governance here in China. That is, the government is total. The government is reaching out to nearly every aspect of social, political, and educational life. And so people is not afraid of the government. Instead, people expect the state to do many things on their own behalf. Okay. And so here in China, oftentimes when you have some economic problems, we have a national crisis, etc., the reflective response from the average Chinese is to empower the government, to give more power to the government. Whereas in the United States, I understand, like when you have a national crisis, in political science, you have this rally around the flag effect, right? After 9/11, you have the Patriot Act, right? And during the Second World War, you have many other powers that Congress granted to the president to prosecute the war. So we call this emergency powers. But in normal times, Americans are very reluctant to give more powers to the federal government. But here in China, when the Chinese tradition is that to empower the government to give more power to government officials in order to solve their day-to-day problems, environmental protection, this food security, etc. So to say Ronald Reagan, on his head, is that for most Chinese, government is the solution. Government is not the problem. So I can make that claim. So the fundamental difference between Confucian culture and American culture is that how they view the role of the government in society. Now, what are the implications of the opposing views on the state? You guys view the state as a necessary evil, whereas in China, because you guys carry down the tradition, the intellectual tradition from John Locke, this natural rights, and then you have Rousseau, the separation of powers, the spirit of law, right? And here in China, we carry on the Confucian tradition. So you look at the implications in America, because the government is viewed as a necessary evil, and so you guys tend to have this powerful civil society. Now, what is civil society? It's anything that is other than the government and the business. Now, you go back and check out a copy of Alex de Tocqueville's on the American Democracy. So back in the 1820s, when Tocqueville was touring America, one thing that really struck him is this burgeoning of American society. Americans like to form into groups, clubs, organizations, societies, and etc. Why? Because they think, the number one is you have this First Amendment protection. But second is that you have this view that the government should not take too much responsibility for, governing people's day-to-day life, except these essential things. For example, interstate commerce, building up bridges, canals, and roads to facilitate commerce. Other than that, or national defense, the government should be, separated as much as possible from people's daily life. And so you have this powerful civil society, interest groups, Americans, you have these interest groups, you have lobbies, you have philanthropy groups, you have churches. All these are called civil society. So America has arguably the world's most powerful society, precisely because you have this tradition of forming into groups, and that tradition goes way back to the very beginning of America, and also goes to the America's protection of this, the freedom of association and assembly in the First Amendment, right? So the federal government in the United States has a very limited role in the daily life of the average American. You guys know this better than I do. United States does not have a national police. United States does not have a national, let's say, no police department. You do have a federal Department of Education, but unlike the Chinese Ministry of Education, the Federal Department of Education is mostly an agency for collecting statistics, right? And then there are indeed federal crime, but unless you commit a federal crime, most of the time, if you have a litigation going to a court, you go to your local court, right? So most Americans could spend their whole life without ever getting interactions with the US federal civil servants or government employees. Now, where do you guys get your passport if you want to travel outside the United States, right? You go to the USPS, you get your passport. Now, there's one thing that you guys have to deal with, that is the SSN, Social Security, SSA, Social Security Administration. Now, when you retire, and every month, if you work, you get this Social Security tax or payroll deduction. But other than that, think about death, birth, education, property, police, insurance, marriage, all of these are regular property taxes. All of these are regulated by the states and the local governments. So in that sense, Americans are very, very much, separated from the federal government. In fact, you can say that Washington is conspicuous in American life precisely because of its absence. You don't see the federal government. Now, some of you may disagree with me. You say, hey, wait a second, professor. You look at this, I'll talk about this later, like the abortion rights by the US Supreme Court. You look at the federal government, EPA, no child left behind, minimum wage, etc., right? Yes, those are important issues that the federal government is actively involved in. But you think about your daily life, your local police, firefighters, when you go to public school, the federal government in Washington, D.C. does not tell you which textbook that you use in your school district. What is property tax, right? How much taxes you pay for your property? And how is marriage defined? Where do you get your birth certificate? When somebody dies, where do you get this death certificate? And when you have a marriage, right? So all these things, like, and then you buy a car insurance. So all these things, most Americans really, they don't have anything to do, any business to do with the federal government. So because of that, you have this very strong local government. You have state government, you have county government, and then you have the lowest level, grassroots level in America. That is township and cities, villages, etc. So I lived in Evanston for 6 years. So I know that Evanston has its own police, and even the Northwestern University has its own police. University of Chicago has its own police force, right? And so you look at your own colleges, I'm pretty sure most of you guys also have your own college campus police, and then they would patrol the campus in the evening, and they can stop your car, checking your traffic lights or giving you a ticket, for traffic violations. It's a very, very decentralized governance system in America, precisely because Americans from day one, they distrust a powerful government. Now in China, because of this, you see, as I said, in China, people tend to trust the government. In fact, the higher the level of government, the more trust there is. And then, so because of this, there's a very limited role of civil society in China. Second, the central government has expansive role in our daily life. I can tell you guys, like, what kind of textbooks we use in our public schools. These are regulated by the Ministry of Education. Okay, how much taxes we pay for local, like in the United States, you have local sales taxes, you have state taxes, etc. Right? But in China here, all these are decided by the Ministry of Treasury, the Finance. In the United States, you call this Department of Treasury, and here in China, we call it the Ministry of Finance. Education, police. In China, every police has its own badge, and that badge has a number. It's like in China, you have a national ID system. Americans don't have a national ID. I remember when I first arrived in Chicago, I don't have a driver's license. So I have to go to I think it's a Department of Motor Vehicle, somewhere and on the west side of our campus, to get a state ID. Now, each state issues its own ID, but you don't have a nationalized ID system. Whereas in China, every Chinese citizen, when you are born, you are automatically assigned an 18-digit ID number. And so that number goes with you from birth to death. And so anywhere you go, you can just tell people your ID number. But in the United States, I understand the only thing that is getting close to the Chinese ID system is your SSN, Social Security Number, right? But normally you don't tell people your Social Security number. You don't tell your police when you get stopped on the highway that, this is my SSN. But in China, when you get stopped by the police, oftentimes police numbers, one thing asks you is to show your national ID, and then they swipe the card. And then any information that is collected on your ID in the computer system will automatically show up. Okay. So that's the Chinese way. They nationalize the police, nationalize the education. So the central government has omnipresence in the daily life of the Chinese citizen. And so because of this, in China, we also have provincial governments, we have municipal governments, we have local governments, but these lower level governments have a rather limited autonomy. So let me show you guys some charts. This is from ANES, American National Election Studies. This has been an ongoing survey sponsored by the National Science Foundation and conducted by people at the University of Michigan. So you look at, I don't have data for Americans' trust in local government, but I do have here, this is a very nice time series data for that tracks Americans' trust in the federal government. You look at, this is a compound trust in government index. So you have the average score on the index. You see, the peak was in the early 1960s, Americans' trust in government. And then you can see a very clear declining trend, right? And so by 2020, you see Americans' average trust in the federal government has dropped below 20 percentage points. Okay, so that is less than 1 out of 5 Americans say I trust the federal government. And now, if you look at a response to another question, elections make the government pay attention. You see, the lower line represents not much. You can see that from 1964 until 2020, you see, again, a steady, even though it's not a sharp increase, but it's a steady increase of the percentage of Americans who say elections don't make the government pay much attention at all. Do you agree with this? No, not much, or good deal. Excuse me. So elections make the government pay a lot of attention or not much attention. You can see increasing number of Americans say elections make the government pay not much attention. And then finally, let's take a look at Americans' evaluation of their representative, that is in the Congress, right? By the US constitutional design, Congress is supposed to be the people's branch. And so that's why you have in the US Constitution, Congress is in Article 1. So you have Article 1 powers, that is congressional constitutional power. Its powers granted by the US Constitution. So you see, the Constitution has 5 articles, and Article 1 is Congress, Article 2 is President, Article 3 is about the judiciary. Okay, let's see how Americans view the branch that is supposed to be closest to them. Again, you can see that Americans don't like their Congress. At least they are not enthusiastic about this, right? About 1 out of 5 Americans say they approve of the performance of Congress, that is their own elected members. So for those of you who know something about US politics, Americans somehow inherently distrust Congress, but they somehow, surprisingly, have very, very favorable views of their own representative. In other words, when you talk about Congress as an institution, most Americans distrust it, dislike it. But when you ask Americans, how do you like about your own representative, senator or congressman from your own district? Most of Americans would say, oh, that is a nice woman. That is a nice man, right? That he represents our interest. So you can see here that when so in political science, you have this thing called somebody runs for Congress by running against it. So you run for Congress by blasting, criticizing Congress as an institution. Okay, so you can see this kind of I do not use the word schizophrenic, but you can see this very divided, conflictual assessment of Congress, between the assessment of Congress as an institution and assessment of members of Congress as individuals. Now, let's take a look at China, right? So this is a survey done by a group of researchers at Harvard's Ash Center, including some of the most well-known sinologists, that is people who study China. They have this ongoing survey starting in 2003, and the last one was in 2016. You can see here is the overall satisfaction by level of government. You can see at the very top, you have the average for the Chinese people's trust of the central government, and then followed by their trust of provincial government. Provincial government in the United States is the equivalent of the state government. And then county government is kind of like in the United States, you have a county, except in the United States, county does not really have a big government building. And then below the county level, we have a township level. When I was doing the screenshot, I didn't keep the lower parts of the chart. You can see that there's this descending order of trust. The average for the central government is above 3 percentage points. And then you can see that once you go down one level below, there is a slight decrease in trust in the provincial level government. And then you go down to county level, you can see there is a significant decrease in terms of trust. Okay, so you can see this. We can borrow from sociologists say that there is a stratification of trust in China. The higher the government, the more trust there is, and then the lower the government, less trust there is. Now, this is a research done by Antigovernment. It's a consulting firm. And so starting in 2017, I believe, they began to track this global trust. They survey 20 or sometimes up to 27 countries around the world, and then they ask people whether they trust the government or not. You can see this, in 2021, they surveyed 27 countries, and the score for China was 72. And so China was behind India. China was ranked number 2, right? And so the average score was 56. And then you look at the most recent finding from 2020, and you see China had a big gain. China's the trust score for China increased by 11 points. That is, China was 72 in 2021, and now China stood at 83 in 2022. And so China is ranked number 1 overall among the 27 countries surveyed by Antigovernment. And then you look at UAE, that's very surprising, I think, to many people, United Arab Emirates. And then followed by Indonesia, India, Saudi Arabia, Malaysia. Very strikingly, you guys can notice that there are very few Western democracies ranked at the top. Okay, you can see the Western democracies are, you can find the Netherlands, and then you have Canada, Australia, Italy, but their scores are below 57, whereas China has a score of 83. So you can see between 21 and 22, the biggest gainers, China, UAE, and Thailand. And the biggest losers are Germany, Australia, the Netherlands, South Korea, and the United States. Okay. So this is not something that is, let's say, maybe some of you guys are skeptical about the data, but again, the two data I just cited are from Western scholars. The first one is from a group of very well-respected China scholars at Harvard, and then, this one is done by a well-known consulting firm called Antigovernment. You guys can check out the data about government trust. And so for those of you who really want to understand China, I think this is would be a very interesting research for you guys to do, is that why, from an outsider point of view, if you guys watch this human rights report from the United States State Department, if you follow like the Human Rights Watch or Amnesty International, you follow New York Times and Washington Post, you get a strong sense that Chinese government is bad, right? You get a strong sense that there's very little that you can say good about the Chinese government. And so you would have something kind of like a pity. You would think that, oh, how terrible it is for the Chinese people to live in that country, right? But then you contrast that kind of a perception you get, the things that you get from all these mainstream US media, government agencies, human rights groups, and then you compare that kind of reporting coverage of China with this survey data. How do you square the two? On the one hand, outsiders are painting a kind of an abysmal picture of Chinese governance. They say, oh, there's no hope for China. unless China, becomes something like America, and there's, Chinese people would live in poverty, Chinese people would be living a bad life, right? But then you look at how Chinese people actually evaluate their own government. It's quite different. This is a big puzzle. And I know that a lot of American scholars, they want to unpack this black box. Why, from an outsider point of view, that China should be evaluated very negatively by its people. But in fact, you look at the survey data again and again, right? So that's why today, when Western scholars and Western government officials criticize Chinese government, Chinese people, many of them get very upset. And they say, look, you look at the data, Chinese people, these are not data, concocted or manufactured by Chinese scholars. These are research, serious research, funded by American, scholarly agencies, and they are conducted by reputable scholars. And then they produce strong evidence that the Chinese people trust the central government. So this is a big puzzle, and it's something that we need to square. And American, especially those critics of China, they need to bear in mind that unless they don't believe this data, they think the data are lying. Now, let me move on to next one, the individual and the state. In America, we all know this term individualism. What is individualism? Everybody, you can have your own choice of your lifestyle, right? What do you want to do about your own life? Do I want to be a scientist? Do I want to be an engineer? But more importantly, when it comes to your relationship with the state, you say, well, what is the relationship between me and the American government? Americans often say, oh, there's a Bill of Rights. You see the language of the Bill of Rights. Congress shall not, the right to bear arms shall not, right? You see the language that is used by the founding fathers, people like Thomas Jefferson and George Washington. So it's prohibiting the government from doing something. So in America, the individual's life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This is said in the Declaration of Independence, right? So an individual's life and liberty and pursuit of happiness has a higher priority than the interests of the state. That's my understanding of individualism. Okay, so if you guys say, I want to have zero Coke, fine. I want to have regular Coke, that's fine. I prefer to drive a BMW. Other people say, I want to drive Mustang, others, right? That's your own choice, and you can make your own choice. I still remember this is one word that struck me when I was a student in the United States. People often say you have to give people a choice. People can have the freedom to make the choice, right? Choice means that you are not coerced, you are not compelled to do something. So if you have something, your habits, your behavior, your style, the way that you dress, the way that you eat, the way that you drive your car is different. Of course, assuming that you don't, threaten public safety. And so people would leave you alone. That's individualism. So the state has no business in regulating what kind of food you want, right? And what kind of car you want to drive, what kind of books you want to read, right? I think that's the relationship between the individual and the state. and besides, because of this individualism, individual success, independent thinking, self-reliance are valorized in the United States. You look at people like Elon Musk, look at Warren Buffett, look at Bill Gates, and so individual successes are valorized, and the people look up to these guys and say, hey, they have so much wealth because of their hard work ethics, and their self-reliance. Okay, so that's about the individualism part. Now, what about China? In China, like I said, the Confucian culture puts a lot of score on collectivism. What is collectivism? Collectivism means at the most basic level that there's much less emphasis on individuality or individualism. And there's more that the interest of the state. Now, when I say the state, does not have to be the state, the central government, but rather it's not about individual, but a group, a collective that has a higher priority than those of the individual. So in China, we have this saying that if there is no state, there would be no family or individual. Now, if you tell Americans this, Americans would be shocked. What are you saying? You say that if there's no central government, like the government in Washington, D.C., there would be no me or my family. So you say the government in Washington comes first, and then my individual life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness comes second. I think 99.9% of Americans would disagree, right? But here in China, we're taught and we're used to this. That is, if there is no strong government, if there's no powerful state to protect you from foreign invaders, and you know Chinese history, the Opium War in 1840, and then aggression by the Japanese, and then China was divided up by foreign powers in the 19th century, and then we had the Civil War. So China had over 100 years of humiliation at the hands of foreign powers. And so for the ordinary Chinese, if you don't have a state, you would have no family or individual freedom or liberty to talk about. And so, sorry, let me plug in the power. My notebook is running out of battery. So because of this, here, people are used to this, that we need to sacrifice for the larger good of the collective, the state or the class, for example, or the university, or for the some common good. So individual sacrifices for collective good here in China is not only required, but also valorized. I think this is a very, very different from the United States. And we can talk more about this, later during the Q&A, or you guys can check out some books about Chinese collectivism. Now, social interactions. Let me come to this very interesting part. This is largely based on my own observations. I lived in Chicago for 6 years, and of course, I grew up in China. So I constantly see this cultural interactions. And it's getting very interesting. I call this equality versus hierarchy. Social interactions in America is based on equality, whereas social interactions in China here is largely hierarchical in nature. Okay, let me elaborate on this. In the United States, you all know, you read the Declaration of Independence, right? All men are created equal. And so this is a political equality. And that leads to this social equality. There's no inherited titles. There's no monarchy. There's no aristocracy in America. And so people are born equal, not just politically, but socially. And so American social interactions tend to be just like in their politics, very, very equal. I give you a couple of examples and you guys understand. So one example that struck me is that Americans tend to use first name, right? How do you call your dad or your mom? And in China, you don't use first name to call your dad or your mom or your grandfather or your professor. Unless, of course, occasionally you do hear Chinese call some other people by their first name. That's very rare, and that's only because you have a very, very special and intimate relationship, and you know that guy very well. Okay. And so here in China, if you want to address a professor, university president, a doctor, whatever, you would have this suffix, okay, professor, etc. Whereas in the United States, I understand that between a father and son, a daughter and a mom, between a student and a professor, and you almost always use first name. Okay? And we don't do this here in China. Second is that when Americans address each other, they almost always omit words that denote family or social relations. So in English, you see, the other than dad and mom, grandfather, grandmother, right? The words that can describe your relationship with your other family members are very limited. Cousin, nephew, and niece, and these are the words, right? Very few. But in China, you have many, many words that not only describe the maternal and the paternal side of your family relationship, but also denote this hierarchical relationship. Grandmother, aunt, sister, and not only you understand this hierarchy, but you also use these words. So you would say sister A, sister B. You would say aunt A and aunt C. And you don't use the word C or B. You have to add that prefix, aunt or sister or whatever. So here you can see that in China, this hierarchy is explicit and people accept this. And so when I have two kids, and so I often tell them, how do you address other people? You say elder sister, elder brother, and this is uncle, this is a grandmother. And so by telling them, you are telling them that there's a hierarchy, that you have to show respect to people who are older than you. It's an elder brother, elder sister, or an aunt, or an uncle, or grandfather, grandmother, right? Even if you are calling somebody that is not related to you by kinship or by blood. For example, somebody who is just like, I can give an example. My daughter is 80 years old. And so oftentimes we come across a very nice lady. She likes to play with my daughter. And she's about, I think she's retired. She's about in her 60s, I think. So anytime that my daughter sees her, and she would start with this grandpa A or grandpa B, right? And in America, this would be very shocking. Why would I call somebody that has no, blood relationship with me with this appellation grandma or grandpa? But this is a Chinese way of addressing other people to show your respect. And then finally, I can give you another example about this equality and hierarchy in social interactions. Table seating. Have you ever think about how do you guys arrange the seating order during your Thanksgiving dinner, Christmas dinner, or New Year's Eve dinner? I don't think Americans would go into great length thinking about who is supposed to sit at the head of the table, who is going to be seated at the other side of the other two sides of the table, which position implies importance or hierarchy, right? But in China here, this even today is often strictly enforced. Let me show you a chart. This is from a book written by Daniel A. Bell, a Canadian and born political scientist who is now, I think, more or less permanently based in China. He used to teach at Tsinghua University, the Chinese counterpart of MIT. Now he's written extensively on Chinese politics, and I would encourage you guys to check out a copy of this book, Just Hierarchy: Why Social Hierarchies matter in China and the rest of the world. So he started the book with a discussion about table sitting in Shandong province. Shandong is the place where Confucius was born. And so Shandong is in China called the homeland, the land of Confucius. And so there you have a very strong tradition of Chinese culture that is still very much enforced today. You see that here. You have, look at the table sitting here. You have the principal host, and opposite the principal host, you have an assistant host. And to the right hand, you have the guest of honor. And then that is the main guest of honor. And then to the left of the principal guest, a host, you have the second guest of honor. And then you follow the same order. And so you see, this is a typical table sitting order in Shandong province. And it's still quite widespread, and it's very much practiced today. I traveled to Shandong quite a few times. And so when I was there, and my friends, they would treat me as the guest of honor. So usually I would be led to sit on the right-hand side of the principal host. Okay. Very interesting. I don't think that you Americans or Europeans would produce a similar chart for table sitting. Okay. And then before I close, I think I'm running out of time. I prepared much more than we have time for it. We look at society, diversity versus homogeneity. In America, I think when people think about America, one word that comes to mind immediately is this diversity, diverse, right? Why America is diverse? America is a country of immigration. America is a country that values individualism. And also you have the Bill of Rights and protects this political and social diversity. And so all these things make America a strikingly diverse society. So there's very little in America that is viewed as a foreign or unorthodox, right? There's little in America that is considered as orthodox. But in China, this is very different. China is a highly homogeneous society in terms of its demographics and culture. Chinese homogeneity can be seen, you just look at one indicator. About 94% of Chinese population are the Han Chinese. So China is one of the most homogeneous society. And I would prefer to pronounce this homogeneous, but I think in English it's called homogeneous, right? In terms of its demographics. And then there are quite a few countries in East Asia that are similarly homogeneous. For example, Japan and South Korea. You guys go to Japan, South Korea, you can see that their population is also highly homogeneous. Right? And then Chinese culture also is very homogeneous. Whereas in the United States, you have an increasing number of Hispanics, and many of these people tend to speak Spanish at home, or when they, meet with their own inner circles, they would speak Spanish, right? In America is very diverse in terms of race and ethnicity, but China here is much less. As I said, we are a highly homogeneous society. And so in China, because we have a striking degree of homogeneity, and so there is much that is deemed foreign and unorthodox. For those of you who have been to China, or you talk to your mom or dad, or sometimes you read this travel diaries by Americans who have been to China. And one thing you would notice that sometimes they complain about the Chinese, a stranger on the street, they would just come over and approach you and say, "Can I take a picture with you?" Why Chinese people do this? Because you guys like Americans or Europeans, you guys are, racially and facially different, physically different from the Chinese, right? Blonde hair or brown face, skin, etc. So the Chinese feel like this is a exotic, foreign. And so Chinese like to take a picture with you guys. But very few Americans, when they go outside America, they will say, hey, can I take a picture with you? And that reflects this underlying differences in terms of culture and others. Okay. Okay, let me see how much time. I have around about 1 hour and 15 minutes, right? So let me see. Religion. Let me just come quickly to my last slide. Now, America is conceived in religion. Pilgrims, city upon the hill, God's chosen people. You guys all know this is a myth or history. Every nation has its own myth. Okay, so religion is very important to America. America is a nation with the soul of church. This by Chesterton, right? This very famous quote from Lord Chesterton. And then you have First Amendment protection of religious freedom. You have a pervasive influence of Christian beliefs on almost every aspect of political and the social life in America. And America also tends to be the most religious of all Western democracies. So America is religious. There's no question about it. Whereas China, Confucianism is not a religion per se, as you guys understand this. Confucianism, I would say, it's the most important secular, if not official, religion in China, because Confucianism governs almost every aspect of Chinese social and political life, and so that's more or less like a secular religion. But in China, after 1949, because we are under the Communist Party of China, and so communism practices atheism. So officially, we don't have a religion here in China, right? But the Chinese government does allow people to practice different religions, like especially Buddhists and others, right? Tibetans, they have their own religious belief too, but that's part of Buddhism too. And then so religion's presence and influence in China is rather limited. You don't see this. Of course, when you guys come over to China, for example, in Beijing, you have the Buddhist temple called the Lama Temple in Beijing, which is one of the most popular tourist sites for Western visitors. And then you have these Buddhist temples in Hangzhou, you have Taoist temples outside Beijing. There are many, many of them, so you can go and see them. But at least in China here, religion is not part of the official worldview, right? Because we are a communist country. But more importantly, I want to show you guys how religious America is. And this makes America really an outlier among Western democracies. So this is from Gallup. You can see that in 2021, about 49, that is about half of Americans still say religion is important in your life. And then there are about 1/3 of Americans say religion is fairly important. If you add these two up together, that means about 2/3 of Americans still say religion is very important in their life. This is a remarkable, remarkable percentage of people who say this. And this shows, maybe you can use the word religiosity of Americans, right? And next, oftentimes people say it's important, but what about your behavior? Do your words square with your actions? So this is again from Gallup. You can see how often do you attend a church or synagogue every week, almost every week, about once a month, seldom or never. You can see about 1 out of 5 Americans say they still go to a church or synagogue every week. And then almost every week, another about 10%. So if you add these two up together, about 1/3 of Americans still go to a church or a synagogue almost once a week. If you do a similar survey in Western European countries like France or UK, the percentages would be much, much lower. Now, because of this pervasive influence of religion, and America was founded on this, pilgrims and this Protestantism. So religion has kind of a disproportionate role in American politics. So in America, look at God, public disputes about the role of God in public display, for example, Pledge of Allegiance, the government assistance to religious schools, right? So it's about God and the gays, sexual orientation, and right now, abortion. I think most of you guys know what I'm talking about. That is, a couple of days ago, there's this leaked draft opinion from the U.S. Supreme Court that shows that there is a majority that is going to vote to overturn the 1973 landmark Roe versus Wade, right? And so this is causing a huge controversy in America right now. This has a huge bearing on the coming midterm elections. Whereas in China, because religion is not part of the government, is not part of the Chinese tradition, so none of the three issues is controversial or religiously charged. So look at this. Leak heightens the perception of a polarized Supreme Court. Look at how Americans protest, how this gets emotionally charged. One of the most polarizing issue in America today is abortion. And so it's very hard for the Chinese to understand why is this getting so controversial. And it's because of religion. Right? Okay, let me conclude by saying a few words. The two great powers are separated by a vast gap in cultures, and these two cultural differences have certainly added to their complicated relations. Americans value diversity at home, but prefer homogeneity abroad. So Americans like to say, end of the history, right? Liberal democracy everywhere. The world should all look like America in terms of democracy. But once at home, Americans value diversity. You see, this is a kind of a contradiction in American, the way of thinking about foreign policy and domestic policy. Diversity at home, but homogeneity abroad. Whereas Chinese value homogeneity at home, but advocate diversity abroad. And so the Chinese often say diversity in harmony. Okay, the world is diverse, the world is very big, and so why should the world have just one political system that is called liberal democracy, whatever you call it? We should allow different political systems to coexist peacefully. And so that's why we have this slogan, diversity in harmony. So it's nearly impossible to change the other's culture. We all know that culture is resistant to change. So the best is for the two great powers to appreciate those differences and their implications for the other's domestic and the foreign policy behavior. Okay, so I rushed through my talk, and I hope this will be helpful for you guys to get a better sense of why the Chinese and the Americans, especially at the government level, they often get to quarrel with each other and do many things that you think are very puzzling. I hope this my talk will be the first step in getting you guys interested in understanding Chinese culture and in contributing to a better relationship between the two countries.